So I think the most significant trends in cybersecurity are also some of the trends that we're seeing in technology development in general. And one that I'd point to is the increasing network connectivity of devices that power parts of our everyday lives. This Internet of Things revolution where there's smart everything. This opens up new avenues and new threats in cybersecurity as well. Every time we connect something to a network, it then becomes exposed and potentially vulnerable to attack and exploit. So that's one thing. The second thing I'd say in terms of trends are a shift away from simply the theft and resale of data for criminal purposes. And now in what we're seeing is this trend, and I think it's one that's here to stay, of ransomware and the holding of data or other systems hostage in order to get payments. This has both criminal implications, but also, I think as you'll see, it has nation-state implications as well. And the final piece I'd say is in the US and Australia is a development and a maturation and approach towards the use of law and international law and diplomacy around cybersecurity. Our countries have worked quite closely together over the past decade, the US and Australia, to advance things like international norms, standards of behavior that we believe countries should subscribe to. We've got great success in that, in the G20 nations signing on to these peacetime norms in 2015, and then other affirmations of the applicability of international law in cyberspace, which countries such as Russia and China have signed on to as well. And so now as we've gotten through some of these initial sort of phase one challenges of approaching this subject, we're moving into an implementation phase. And so one of the trends that we'll have to watch is how do these laws evolve and move forward, but also how does enforcement happen on the other end, and how do we hold people accountable for their behavior in cyberspace? I think it starts with determining values and determining a framework for representing those values and achieving the goals that you set out. So as you build up any program, I think it's important to not sort of rush headlong into technology solutions or different operations, but rather to create a policy and legal framework that will help guide development in more operational or tactical solutions to certain problems that might arise. And so we've been through this quite a bit in the US in terms of establishing those frameworks. We came up with different strategies throughout the Obama administration, and then different laws and policies that mirrored those. Australia's on the same path now. In 2016, you came out with a cybersecurity strategy, the first Australian comprehensive cybersecurity strategy that was updated this year. And then just last week, Australia released an international cybersecurity strategy. And in these documents, you affirm what those policies and ideals and goals happen to be, and they're very consistent with the United States. First and foremost, it's an open and free internet that is unencumbered by government interference. And this stands in stark contrast to some other countries in the world who believe that government should play a role in actually running sort of the internet and network infrastructure. So you start out with expressing those ideals, and then you build the policies underneath. The other thing I'd say is that Australia, if it's going to embark and commit to making cybersecurity a priority, should do something that other countries, I think, have sometimes forgot about, which is putting the citizen first. At the end of the day, the people that ultimately get impacted by cyber attacks are often people, individuals. And just as it's difficult for individual agencies or departments within the government to combat nation states in terms of cybersecurity, imagine how difficult it is for an individual citizen to even wrap their heads around that concept. And so I think as we've talked about these rules and these laws and these technology solutions and protecting businesses, sometimes the little guy gets left behind. And so I would focus on what the consumer protection aspects of cybersecurity are. And more so than just putting in rules that establish those consumer protections, think about how to empower the citizen and give the citizen a sense of being able to take control of their online lives and create an impact that makes them and their families more safe and more secure. Well, Thankfully, the world's paying a lot of attention to cybersecurity, but with most things, we chase the shiny object, and right now that's certainly been ransomware, and I think that's good. It's good that we're paying attention to this threat. It's a compelling criminal case, right? You hold something that someone wants ransom, and you get them to pay you for it. Now, what we've seen so far is holding data ransom, and that can be bad. In some cases, this data is incredibly sensitive, and it's never retrieved back, or it holds emotional significance. It's pictures of your wedding or your kid's birthday party, memories that you want to hold. But the more troubling threat, and I think what we're seeing emerging on the horizon now, is holding operational technology ransom. What we talked about with the Internet of Things and the digitization of all manner of objects that hold function and priority over our personal agency and our physical activity. As we plug those things in, are we now exposing ourselves to our lives being held ransom at certain key points where we rely on digital technology to get us somewhere or to enable some sort of activity? You can imagine rushing to work in the morning and being a little late and hopping in your car and seeing your entertainment console in your car telling you that you're being held ransom and your car won't turn on until you make a payment. That's the sort of threat that worries me more, because it actually impacts our day-to-day physical lives. But it's also dangerous because in doing so, the margin for error is very thin. If someone messes up a ransomware attack and you lose your data, it's not the end of the world. It's not great by any means. But if someone messes up one of these ransomware attacks over something that controls access to your physical lives, the margin for error is that someone gets hurt, someone dies, and that both has a destabilizing impact on society. It also has just a real cost as people get injured. And so that's something that we're going to have to keep real close eye on, and especially close eye on the use of foreign nation states potentially co-opting or masquerading as criminal organizations that are seeking to cause impacts in our countries. Yeah, absolutely. Well, number one, just take personal responsibility. As confusing as technology seems sometimes, if you're going to use it, you got to own up to it. And so being your own best advocate for your personal cybersecurity is just a mindset that's important, right? You can do this. You can take control. The number one thing I would do after coming to grips with that is install multi-factor authentication on every one of the devices that matters to me. So I care about my phone. It has lots of personal information on it. So I add a fingerprint scan onto that in addition to the number that I dial in. Likewise, my email is incredibly important to me. I add a fingerprint. I add additional factor whenever I'm logging in from a new computer and they check that it's me. They give me a phone call and make sure that I'm trying to do that. And likewise with my bank account. Now, there are other things like my New York Times subscription that I could care less about. If you want to read free articles, by all means have at it. So I don't take as many security precautions in that instance. I favor expediency and ease of use. So I'd say add on this extra layer, this sort of deadbolt on the door of security for those accounts that you really, really care about. That's number one, and probably at the expense of missing out on other opportunities, I'd say focus on that. Once you do that, then we'll move up the road onto other stuff. Things like password managers are incredibly useful in this space. They generate complex passwords and also alleviate the pain of having to remember passwords on different websites, which I personally really struggle with. And the other one that I think's really good that we could then talk about is constantly updating your phone, for instance, when you see that there's a new operating system upgrade or a new app upgrade. The reason why companies are issuing upgrades is because they've detected security vulnerabilities in the old systems. So if you're not immediately upgrading, you're leaving yourself exposed, and criminals know that, and so they go out and they seek those people. They target people specifically who haven't made those upgrades. But start with MFA, and then we'll get into a conversation about the rest.